loud. Can you just turn it down a smidge? Perfect, thank you. Okay. Wow, that woke me up. Hope it woke you up as well. Hi, good afternoon. My name's Mark. I think we're about 3/4 of the way through the introductory Ecology and Sociology 101 class. So we're glad you can join in. It's been quite the journey as we head south. We're actually, I looked on the TV before we came, and I think we're somewhere just south of the lake that Richard was talking about today in Nicaragua. So we've gone past El Salvador and we're heading on down. So we're passing some of the most ecologically diverse areas on the planet in the interior. The coastline's a little bit disappointing from an ecological perspective, but we're going to have a look at the coast today. So we were up here off the ship yesterday. We've steamed past El Salvador, and we've steamed past that little tiny piece of Honduras there, and we're somewhere down here right now, right off of the Nicaraguan coast. What I'm going to talk about today is primarily the pieces in El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua, with a little bit of Costa Rica before we get into the Panama. A few people have been asking about the presentations for tomorrow and the following day. The presentations were supposed to be on the 14th, but we will be in Panama City on the 14th. So the presentations from the 14th have been moved to tomorrow, and Richard will be talking about the Panama Canal at 10 a.m. here. So that's the Panama Canal. And I'll be talking about everything that's not the Panama Canal tomorrow afternoon at 2. So we're not at 1 o'clock, but at 2 o'clock tomorrow here. So they moved me from a little tiny room back to here tomorrow at 2. So Richard in the morning at 10 on the Panama Canal, and me in the afternoon at 2 o'clock on everything that's not the Panama Canal. I was just talking to a gentleman today about plate tectonics, and I've got one slide today, and he was asking whether the lecture on plate tectonics could be repeated, but we'll see whether that transpires and whether they can get it back onto the TV. So, looking at the countries, El Salvador is the smallest one that we're steaming past. Very densely populated and defined by fertile highlands, but it's not as high as Honduras. Honduras is known for the mountainous terrain and its long Caribbean coast. It's got a great big Caribbean coast. Not that we're going to be able to see that then on this trip. And then obviously we've had a little bit of a look at Nicaragua. Costa Rica is known for its diversity and for its ecotourism. So where we are right now is somewhere in here. We're in that area where the Cocos Plate is hitting the Caribbean Plate. And Richard mentioned the Arenal volcano this morning. Just for those of you who haven't seen it, I wanted to give you an idea of earthquakes and earthquake zones. We're coming down into something right here in the Panama, which is a lot quieter because the plate boundaries are here. The colors are basically the depths. The reds and yellows are up to about 100 kilometers down into the crust. So you can see that subduction zone is really creating earthquakes at depth. And it really makes us understand why it's a bad idea to build a lot of big things in this area unless you can build them properly and safely. I lived in Santiago, Chile for a little while, and in Santiago, Chile, if we got a 4.2 every week, it was normal. We didn't even notice it. Well, we did notice it. One day my two sons were staying with me, and my youngest son was in bed, and he got out of bed and he was furious because he thought his brother was shaking the bed to get him awake. His brother was in the shower. It was nature that was shaking the bed to wake him up. So that was really interesting, and it was quite funny actually, because he was very annoyed at nature for waking him up. So anyway, this is the Ring of Fire. This is part of the Ring of Fire. We've talked quite a bit about it. Remember that it's not just these smaller plates. It's not just the great big plates there are a lot of smaller plates like the Caribbean plate and the Cocos plate, and even the Nazca plate here, that all kind of interact together to make this an interesting mess from a geological perspective. And from the sociological perspective, its history is also interesting. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we move along. So we've got a mess geologically, we've got a mess sociologically, but we've got a fantastic environment in which to live. El Salvador, this is a beach in El Salvador. As you can see, El Salvador is not a very, very popular place for tourism right now. It was even less popular in the 70s when it was the focus of international attention between the 70s and early 90s. There was a lot of disruption. There was a lot of civil war inside, internal and external conflicts. It's an odd place, El Salvador, because it's got almost 100% mixed population. So the population in El Salvador married extensively, intermingled with the Spanish that came along. So 90% of the population in El Salvador identify as mestizo. And only 10% of the population in El Salvador are actually identify as indigenous people. So it's really quite interesting, and it affects the way the country runs. But El Salvador itself, beautiful areas on the coast. Going a little bit further down, looking at Honduras. Honduras is famous for its forested areas, beautiful tropical forest. For those of you that watched my talk on freshwater, this is a middle river stretch. Capital is Tegucigalpa. Try saying that after a couple of years. And it's got, we won't be going there, but it exports a lot of textiles. You can get a lot of t-shirts that are made in Honduras. It's got coffee, sugarcane, and tropical fruits. So it's a really mixed economy in Honduras. So let's have a quick look at where the ocean meets the land, what the coastlines look like. We'll have a look at the coastlines as we go. These coastlands are mostly black sand beaches, a little bit of darker beach here you can see, except in parts of Nicaragua where you get a nice whiter sand beach. Coastal areas of all the countries they have a complicated piece of ecology because they've got sandy beaches, but then in behind them are the mangroves. And you see these mangroves are the areas where we've spoken at wildly, very biodiverse. You can see some egrets here sitting in the trees, in the mangrove trees. The egrets eat fish. There's lots of fish habitat and lots of biodiversity in the roots. The roots of the mangrove are actually quite interesting. You've seen them on the photographs. They look like a bunch of sticks coming down. They've got the center of the root has a special cell called parenchyma, and the parenchyma actually allows oxygen to pass down the roots and right into the bottom. If you've got a root that is normally in soil, right, you've got air in the soil because it's not saturated all the time. However, the roots of the mangrove, they're always saturated, they're in mud, the mud is sticky, there's no oxygen in the mud. But they've got special cells that take the oxygen down because the cells from the roots need to respire, exactly the same as our cells. And so they're quite kind of an interesting plant in that particular case. And remember, we were talking a little bit about ecosystem services. It's a very nice way to say what the ecosystems do for us and why we should keep them. Obviously, they provide protection to the coastal areas. They prevent flooding. They stabilize the coast. They clean the water. High biodiversity. Now, biodiversity is a bit of an esoteric thing. We like biodiversity. We like the concept of biodiversity, and it's a thing that we will pay for, but it's very difficult to say what it actually does for us. Biodiversity for us does what? But it's a conceptual thing. And then finally, obviously, they provide a great nursery for young fish. So it's a fabulous thing. The other thing that's on the coast in the Caribbean, and we'll see quite a bit of it as we sail through up to Florida, we'll probably come up through here, are coral reefs. The coral reefs in the Eastern Pacific, as you can see, are almost non-existent. there are a few. Most of the biodiversity in the area of the coral reefs that we look at will be in the Caribbean itself. But we do have coral formations off the coast of El Salvador, Costa Rica, and then going down to Ecuador, Panama. Obviously, the islands off Ecuador are very diverse, biodiverse. And the northern limit here is probably the Gulf of California. Up on this side, we don't get much coral beyond Los Cabos. You get a little bit on the inside in the Gulf of California, and it's actually quite nice snorkeling up there. But the Galapagos Islands, of course, way down here, they've got beautiful coral as they go. Some of the coral that we see on the coast, and this is off Costa Rica, this is called Whale's Tail Beach. And you can obviously see the formation here of the whale's tail, and the beach is available. It's got tidal in the piece in the middle, so you've got two beaches, one on either side, which get covered at high tide and are exposed at low tide. And then you've got a coral formation that forms this lovely beach here. This is called Whale's Tail Beach. When you see the coral on the west coast, it's not that bright, vibrant coral that you see in the Caribbean. It's a little bit duller. It's got lots of holes for places for people to live. Well, not people, but things to live. But you don't see that bright coral colors. You're not seeing the diversity of fish. You see quite a few fish, but not the diversity that you see in the Caribbean. And this is by virtue of the nature of the ecosystem on the west coast. You've got a little bit more sediment coming in. You've got varying temperatures, and you've got also the effects of like the coastal environment itself. It's just not conducive for coral formation. Around the islands, yes. So if we look a little bit as we move further south, this is a beautiful beach in El Salvador. You can see the mountains. Everything goes straight up. Everything goes straight up as we go up into the hinterland. And if we look at the coast of El Salvador, you'll see there's no crinkly bits. There's a little bit of an estuary here, obviously a very biodiverse area, mangroves, etc. But there's no real ports. The only port that we've got in the whole of El Salvador, this is El Salvador here, the only port that we have is right here. And if we look a little bit closer at the port, you'll see it's almost all man-made. There is a river that comes in here, but this is the port of Acajutla. Can we say that as well? That one's quite interesting. But it essentially supplies everything to El Salvador. We've looked at quite a number of ports as we've come down the coast, and this one supplies containers. It's got oil delivery, and if you look up here, there's a natural gas terminal as well. So this is essentially what forms where everything that goes into El Salvador comes through. You can't grow it locally. It comes mostly through this port. So it's very, very important port, and obviously it's been developed quite a lot over the last little while. The containerization piece is increasing all the time. Other things that are important in the area are fishing. Fishing for El Salvador has been a key part of the economy for a long time. The majority of the boats are these small boats off the coast, and then you're getting some boats like this. These ones are fishing for shrimp. They've been the economy, the coastal economy. You can get these small boats in almost anywhere along the coast. The bigger boats need a proper port to come into. Small-scale fisheries, particularly in Central America. In Costa Rica, for instance, 75% to 80% of the actual fish caught are caught with these small boats. It's not an industrial fishery like you'll find in many other places. Most of the fishermen in these are men. However, women are involved in catching of oysters, removal of anything that's kind of a mollusk, like a shellfish. Women tend to be involved in that. It's really a strange dichotomy. So the men go out and fish for this. And if it's oysters, shellfish, that sort of thing, then the women are involved, and the women are involved extensively in the packing. Still, the most lucrative piece is happy smiling guy who's going to throw his fish back. He's going to catch it and release it. Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala. The biggest amount of money comes in from tourism and ecotourism for fishing. Again, this is a great business when the economy's good. But the first thing that goes down when the economy gets bad in the US or Canada is we don't go on holiday, we don't go on a fishing trip, because it's not cheap to go on these fishing trips. But that's where you've got that cycling. So you've got to understand that you still need the sustainable fishery. These big, fancy, expensive boats are very expensive to keep. And just to give you an idea of the different species of fish, this is Costa Rica. We were going into this area, and I will talk a bit about this area before. But you can see everything that you can catch, from marlin to tuna. All of the marlin, sailfish are all catch and release. The tuna you can keep. And I actually really like the tuna. It's a great thing. So all over the place, including some of the inland waterways, you've got good fishing. Even in Lago Arenal, that one right there, you've got fishing. So big business, big opportunities, but also a little bit risky if you have a downturn in the economy. So we'll move on from the ecology part, and we'll look at what Central America looked like before the arrival of the Spanish, and we'll look at the first peoples. This gives you a little bit of an idea of the diversity of where the major groups were through Central America and down into the northern part of South America. We'll look at a couple of the ones that we're going to be in this area here where we're coming past. We'll look at the Chorotega, and we'll look at the Bribri people. Richard put up an interesting graphic, somewhat similar to this one the other day, just showing the timelines of when the people and when the civilizations came through and were present and disappeared in South and Central America. You'll see the Mayans, this big yellow bar here, endured for quite a while. It's about 3,500 years. That's pretty good for any civilization. The Aztecs, however, they lasted about 200 years. So you had the Mayan civilizations enduring, going from very, very fundamental, very rudimentary, almost no farming, to a very complex society. And then the Aztecs came in, and obviously most of it finished with the Spanish. Remember, the Spanish didn't win all the wars, they won part of the wars, and they also had killed off the people through disease. That was by accident rather than by fact. So just have a look. Here we are, the present day, somewhere out in here. But that kind of gives you an idea of these cultures come up and they go down. They come up and they go down. You can see that in Europe, the rise of the Roman Empire, the rise of the Ottomans, the Egyptians, they all fluctuate. It's interesting, in Central America, the population on the coast came through the first migration about 14,000 years ago. And they came down the coast, and they basically came all the way down the coast and across into South America using coastal routes, usually with kayaks, canoes, and other boats that they could kind of come down the coast itself. However, what people don't realize is that throughout history there have been then movements of populations inside. So they just didn't come and stay. So for instance, in this particular case, there was the movement down here to get the migration of the Pilpil into El Salvador. And they actually came from Mexico. So you've got the Gulf of Mexico, this is the Yucatan Peninsula, Cancun is somewhere up here. And they moved down, no, that's not Cancun. Sorry, this is Mexico. This is coming through Guatemala, this is Guatemala, and then down into El Salvador. So there was a migration here. So you had the first migration coming in down the coast and then movement inland. And then the second migration was when these tribes and groups of people decided that they were not going to come, they didn't like where they were, they'd move along, they'd conquer the adjacent people, and they'd keep doing that. The Pilpil came through, probably first people in this area were 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, but then there was a later movement around 900 to 1300, so kind of about 1,000 years ago they moved into the area. They ruled over Mexico, southern Guatemala, and down into El Salvador. So the people of El Salvador, we'll look a little bit at the what they did for this. These are some of the, again, it was all based on Aztec and Mayan history. These people moved down from Central America. They set up the big temples. They set up the sun gods. They did the sacrifices. They did everything. But they developed their own culture. So these people, the Pilpil, they also had a fairly stable system, a fairly stable economy. They grew maize. They had formal markets. They had farms. It was a very stable economy, but it all came to an end when the Spanish came in. If you look at the types of housing that they lived in, this is a village from today, but it's very indicative of the types of houses that they would have 400 or 500 years ago when the Spanish showed up. So these people in El Salvador were also called Cuscutlan, and that was the Spanish name for the group. And the alternate word for El Salvador today is still Cuscutlan. And tropical climate, it allows for lots of cultivation. And today, El Salvador is starting to get a more diverse economy in the agricultural sector. There's a huge appetite for fresh tropical fruits in the north, and so El Salvador is exporting things like mango, papaya, tamarinds, oranges, and then obviously in the winter they can grow lettuce and tomatoes for export to the north. So you never know, if you look at your papaya in your supermarket, it may well come from El Salvador. Most of them come from Mexico, but that's the way it is. So if we move on to the Chorotegas, and this is, you're all familiar with this actually is almost where we were supposed to go. What I'm showing here is I'm showing the Gulf area where the Chorotegas were. There's a thing called the Isthmus of Rivas, which is here. This is the lake in Nicaragua that has the two volcanoes that we'll talk about in a little while. But you had a whole people that was very dominant in this area called the Chorotegas. Again, another group of people that came down through Central America inland. These were people that decided that they were just going to move in, and they did a little bit of what the Spanish did. They took over the indigenous communities who were living here, and they basically enslaved them, mixed in with them, and they made a whole new. This is the Chorotega area right here, and they had a similar society. This is again, we have to take these artists' sketches with a grain of salt. They rather simplify this. Everybody's got a smile on their face, except for the pig. But it's an area that they had fixed villages, farmland around them. They came in and they were the most powerful tribe in Central America for many, many years. They came from the Chiapas area of Mexico. They came down, they dominated with war, and they overtook the people. But again, they had a social structure that had a hierarchy. So they had everything that was in there. They had chiefs, they had family groups, but they had an area that they lived, and they tended the farms around them, and then they would hunt out beyond that with bows and arrows and swords and with flint knives and that sort of thing. So these were not a very peaceful people, the Chorotegas, but They actually lived close to the Ometepe Lake. And this is the lake that we looked at a little bit. It's called Ometepe. Ome in the native language means two. Tepe means peak, so it's called Ometepe is what the little islands there. The interesting thing is that these two islands that we see here, and this is one of the volcanoes on one of the islands there. It was seen as the promised land by these people. It was kind of the Eden, and the Chorotega people did a lot of carving, and there's an Ometepe archaeological project, and the Ometepe archaeological project has found over 2,000 of these carved stones, and a lot of them feature circles. And then these are the prize ones. These are the ones these remind me a little bit of Easter Island as you think about it. You know, they're gods that have been put up, and they're facing somewhere important, probably the sunrise or the sunset, and they put a lot of work into this, and they've got time to do all of this. These people have got time to do all of this. What does that mean? That means that they've got a stable economy, and they're not always hunting for food. When we were hunter-gatherers, all we could do was paint on the walls where we lived with our hands as cave paintings. But now we've got formation of art, and we've got formation. So they found a phenomenal number of these things in the jungle, and there's probably a lot more to be created. And they think they date back about 3,000 years. So Ometepe, two peaks. If we move on into Costa Rica, we've got the same kind of group, but now we're getting to some kind of interesting things. This is not a violent people. They're living in huts made of thatch like we've seen before in a lot of these places. And in Costa Rica today, it's quite interesting. About 100,000 people are indigenous, which is only 2% of the population, but there's several languages. Costa Rica is interesting because it's the link through Panama to the Amazon, and it's the link through there for various culturally important places. And one of the things that we're looking at right now is we're looking at, again, these huts are remarkably similar to the ones that we saw in San Francisco and all the way down the coast. So we're all living in thatched huts. Remember that the coastline has changed a lot over the last little while. This is the Bribri in Costa Rica. They were skilled agriculturists, skilled farmers, very good at agroforestry as well. They did a lot with trees, and I'll show you why they did a lot with trees in a minute. And they also did things like mixed our crops. So we saw in Mexico where we would grow squash, beans, and corn together because it makes the ideal mix. The same happened here with the Bribri. And their key crops include something called cacao, which we all know as the cocoa bean. So the cocoa bean looks like this, and that's the bit that's inside. Well, it actually doesn't look like that. When you open it up, when you open it up, the bean itself has got these kind of little beans that are covered in this like whitish slime, and it's very slimy. But if you suck the whitish slime, it tastes like chocolate. If you bite the bean, it tastes awful. But the bit that we actually eat is this thing. So I used to run a cocoa plantation in West Africa, so I had quite a bit of experience with these things. So this is one of the few plants that has the flowers actually on the stem. You don't have, like apples, they all grow out on the branches, but the cocoa itself grows on the stem. And you break it open, and you'll see something like this. It's got the whitish piece that I told you tastes like cocoa, and then the beans are inside. They look like this once you take off that. So in order to process it, and it's a fairly simple but complicated, I mean, you can make anything as complicated as you want, right? But essentially what you do is you ferment this, you take off the white piece, you then dry the individual seeds, grind them up, and then you can make them into cocoa powder, pure cocoa powder, or you can add a bunch of sugar and other things and make it into chocolate. And this is one of the sacred plants, if you like, in the Bribri area. And it came from the Amazon. So cocoa itself first came from the Amazon. It came up through Central America. So when you hear of the cocoa ceremonies that are going on, traditionally these were done by the chiefs or by the shaman in the area. And it came from the Amazon up through, and you've probably seen them in Mexico. They were the Johnny-come-latelys because cocoa was very important to the indigenous people in Panama and Costa Rica. So we'll look at a few of the other species. What I wanted to do is just give you an idea of a few of the species that were held sacred in the area. We've talked about cocoa. Cocoa was a very, very important product. It was used as currency. It was used in rituals. People made frothy drinks out of it because it was fermented and that sort of thing. So it was really, really important. And it's not just your block of Nestle or whatever it is that you've got on your supermarket shelf. It has a lot more historical importance. Another animal that was very, very important to the people in Central America was the jaguar. Not just the car, but the animal itself. They considered a symbol of power and strength. Both the Aztecs and the Mayans thought jaguars were gods. So this is the powerful predator, and it featured in many of the cultures as a really important piece. If you had a jaguar skin, then you were the chief. That was they were the only people that were really allowed to have it, and they had jaguars. And this comes from one of the sacrifice areas. So what would happen? This is a stylized jaguar, of course. In the Mayan era, when they sacrificed people on the altar, they would cut the hearts out and they would put them in this little hole, and then they would burn them. Like, not very nice, but hey, that's history as you go along. So if you got sacrificed, it was an honor. Your heart was put in there and it was burned. So the jaguar formed a really key part of that. The other important piece is the quetzal. That's the that you saw yesterday, probably quite a lot of on the stalls when you were in Guatemala. You see the quetzal. It was considered sacred by the Aztecs and the Mayans, and they used these feathers for ceremonial purposes, for headdresses and that sort of thing. And there were also some bats that were culturally important. So moving on to the plants, this is the cyber tree. The cyber tree is also known as the kapok tree. When I was a kid, we used to get kapok, and they used to stuff pillows with this stuff called kapok. Now it's all some kind of synthetic fiber, but when I was a kid, you used to get this kapok, and that came from this tree. The Mayan believed that this tree, which stands out above all the other trees in the forest, connected the heavens up here with its root systems to the spiritual underworlds. So they thought that there was a direct connection through this tree to the spiritual underworld. They used the roots. The roots are edible, the flowers, the seeds. So and then they used the kapok, which is the seed pod on the top, for stuffing things like pillows and jackets and that sort of thing. The real connection to the underworld was through these hallucinogenic drugs that they revered. So you've got the peyote, which is this cactus that you can see up on the left-hand side, and then we've got ayahuasca, which is this plant here on the other side. Both of these are hallucinogenic, and they're a psychedelic drug, and the shaman used to use these for predicting the future, reading smoke and all that kind of thing. So these were actually very important plants in the area. And you can see on the left side a little bit of the resin from called copal. Copal was another important piece. This was burned in ceremonies, and you can still buy it today, actually. You can still buy it today to burn in your home. It's not a psychedelic, so you don't have to worry about it. And there's all sorts of papers and literature on whether peyote and ayahuasca are actually illegal in various countries and that sort of thing. So we move through psychedelic drugs, and we'll move on to the Spanish. Spanish, and again, this is a very stylized and probably sanitized version of what the Spanish did to the Incas and the Mayas and the Aztecs in Central America. They essentially subdued them, and they got them to be very subdued. But the Mayas and the Aztecs and the other people in Central America were very resilient. It was a very it was a conquest, but not a total conquest. They were able to get the money, they were able to control the countries, but there was a resistance in the people to keep their culture. So there were many, many times where the Spanish were overthrown, they were thrown back out. We mentioned a few of them in some of the previous talks. They also disappeared up into the hills. So the Spanish would come in, they'd take the coastland, the tribes would disappear up into the hills where they could live, a little bit like the current Afghanistan, right? You put a lot of troops into Afghanistan, and the people disappear up into the hills, and then they come back with a vengeance. And that's what happened in South and Central America. It was never quite as peaceful as you think, and they came back time and time again. There was also the integration of Mayan culture into religious pieces. So the Spanish brought Catholicism across, and also obviously in the Catholic religion, Virgin Mary is very important. However, there's no Virgin Mary well, there is, but not really. There's the Virgen de Guadalupe. And the Virgen de Guadalupe is a stylized version of the Virgin Mary. She had a very native-looking face. You'll see the rays of the sun coming around. The rays of the sun was very, very important in Aztec and Mayan culture. So you're blending the Catholic piece with the Aztec and Mayan culture. If you look on the dress, you'll see Aztec and Mayan print drawings. And the blue was a very, very important in Aztec and Mayan. And if you look right down at the bottom here, this little tiny angel that's holding everything up also has eagle's wings. It does not have angel's wings. So the wings were eagle's wings. So what they did was they combined the Catholic with the Mayan and Aztec culture, and they put the two together. The people also learned how to speak Spanish, but they did what we did. What we do, we learned how to speak Spanish, but we speak English in our home, maybe, right? So when we're out in Mexico, we speak Spanish. When you're at home, you speak that. So your own language. And that's what the Aztecs and the Mayans did. They learned to speak Spanish, but spoke their own languages at home. So if we look at Central America, you can see that there's been a lot of turmoil. There's geological turmoil. There's been tribes come in, native tribes, as well as the Spanish. And then this has all come together to blend these resilient societies that we see today, and the blend of both the culture that you can see here on sale and the natural beauty of the area. One of the things that's happening, and it was one of the reasons we're welcoming Costa Rica, we're welcoming Panama, is that ecotourism is a way that these economies have been able to get a foundation. We're blending modern technology, we're blending modern agricultural techniques to produce mangoes for our table in North America. We can get papaya. I can get papaya in January in Denver. Really? When I grew up, I got strawberries in England in August. That was it. Right? So we didn't have this big diversity of fruits. So what we're seeing here is we're seeing the old world mixing with the new world form a resilient and stable culture. And it really allows us to get that conservation going. We're even connecting some of the old practices of what we did for agriculture with the modern practices for agriculture, trying to reduce inputs from fertilizers. So if we plant beans one year in a field, we don't have to fertilize it the next year because all the nitrogen is back in the soil. So that's all coming together. So with that, I think we're almost at the end. I'd like to say thank you very much. I'm very happy to be able to share this little bit of South and Central America with you, today, and look forward to sharing some more with you tomorrow on the non-Panama canals. So thank you very much.